While slavery was abolished and criminalized many years ago, its haunting legacy continues to affect and resonate with many people to this day. This is particularly evident along the coastline of Ghana in West Africa, where over 30 slave castles continue to stand as haunting reminders of a dark period in human history. From the unthinkable horrors of these slave castles to the deadly door of no return, we'll be revealing the cruelty hidden in the unbearable slave dungeons of Ghana. So join us as we explore the history of these monumental castles and the atrocities that occurred within their walls many years ago. The process of enslavement and the slave trade usually involved three distinct stages. The first was the capture and confinement of people in slave castles, where they were held until ships arrived to transport them. The second stage was the grueling sea voyage, during which many enslaved people died or were abused. And the final stage was the gruesome experience slaves were subjected to in the country where they were forcefully settled. However, today, we'll be focusing on the first stage, which is the capture and confinement of Black people in slave castles. These slave castles were used at the depot to store slaves for several months before loading them on slave ships like cargoes. Along the coastline of Gold Coast, now known as Ghana, a string of castles and forts were constructed between 1482 and 1786. These structures were erected along a 500-kilometer coastline from Keta in the east to Bayen. They were meant to serve as fortified trading posts, while also protecting the occupants from rival European powers and the native population. The Gold Coast was abundant in natural resources, including gold, and attracted the attention of numerous foreign traders. Initially, this involved the exchange of goods such as gold and ivory for manufactured products from Europe. However, over time, the focus shifted towards the transport of enslaved Africans to Europe and America. This was because as plantations in Europe were expanding, there was an increasing need for labor, which in turn fueled the capture and sale of enslaved people from Africa. The slave castles in Ghana. Ghana's coastline boasts more than 30 slave castles, some of which remain standing to this day. One of these castles is Elmina Castle, which happens to be the oldest surviving European-built structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Back in 1482, the Portuguese constructed this fortress in a region abundant in gold and ivory. Over time, Elmina Castle evolved into a vital trading post where textiles and weapons were exchanged for enslaved people. Elmina Castle is located in the southern Cape Coast region of Ghana to the west of Accra, and its strategic position near vital trade routes made it a significant hub for European traders during that era. At the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, an astonishing 30,000 enslaved people were passing through Elmina each year on their way to America. This tragic and horrifying practice continued for nearly 300 years, subjecting countless human beings to unspeakable and deplorable conditions. One of the most haunting features of Elmina Castle is the sharp contrast between its chapel and the dungeons. Inside the castle's chapel, European colonizers worshiped God, while just a few steps away, enslaved people endured unspeakable torture and abuse within the dungeons. Elmina Castle served as a harrowing waypoint for countless enslaved individuals en route to America, Europe, and the Caribbean, where they were forced into grueling labor on plantations and in other demanding industries. In addition to Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle also stands as one of the most well-known slave dungeons in Ghana. Beyond these two notorious sites, Europeans constructed more than 30 slave dungeons along the Ghanaian coastline, each bearing witness to the agonizing history of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the things these slave dungeons had in common was the dehumanization and trading of African slaves. For these slaves, life in the castles were a living nightmare, even before the horrific journey across the Atlantic on slave ships. These castles, strategically located on the coastline near the sea, were designed to facilitate the transport of slaves onto ships as part of the transatlantic slave trade. The location and structure of the castles made it easy to move large numbers of slaves on ships, where they would begin the brutal journey across the ocean. The suffering of African slaves in slave castles. Following their capture by African slavers, enslaved people were then sold to European slavers. These castles served as central depots for the slave trade, where these unfortunate souls were packed together in unimaginable conditions like canned sardines, with no space to sit or lie down. These expansive slave castles conferred a significant advantage upon European traders. By investing resources in these establishments, they forged alliances with local political leaders, guaranteeing a steady flow of both slaves and valuable commodities like gold and ivory. As the slave trade grew and the number of captives increased, the European merchants built additional dungeons at the castle to hold even more slaves. This allowed them to outfit ships more quickly, enabling them to dominate the trade and make more money than their smaller competitors. During their harrowing confinement within the dungeons, enslaved people endured an agonizing period lasting approximately 3 months. These dungeons enforced a brutal separation between men and women. In certain slave castles like Elmina Castle, the dungeons were situated deep underground, while churches were constructed above them, reflecting the Christian faith of the majority of Europeans involved in this trade. This juxtaposition of faith and suffering within these castle walls serves as chilling evidence of the dark, hypocritical, and haunting history that transpired in these castles. The conditions at the castle were deplorable, since it was extremely cramped, dirty, and unhygienic. Slaves were forced to defecate and urinate where they stood, and over time, the waste would accumulate at knee level, leading to a terrible stench. Adding to the horrible condition of the dungeons was the lack of proper ventilation. The only source of fresh air was a few small holes in the roof, which were often not enough to provide sufficient air circulation. The combination of the foul air, high temperature, and cramped conditions resulted in many slaves dying from suffocation. This also led to the spread of sickness and diseases among the slaves, and was so bad that many slaves died before they even made it onto the ship. The lack of food and water, combined with the unsanitary conditions, led to widespread malnutrition and starvation among the slaves in the dungeons. Many became greatly emaciated, while others also died as a result of starvation because their bodies were too weak to withstand the harsh conditions. Even when the slaves were fed, they were forced to do so in the same filthy, cramped cell where they slept and relieved themselves. In addition to the physical and emotional suffering of the slaves, many female slaves were also victims of sexual assault and rape by the European captors. Although some women were employed as servants in the castles, many others were subjected to constant sexual violence. While rebellious females were beaten and chained to cannons, male slaves were forcefully sent to the death dungeon. At the entrance of these death dungeons was a skull and an X underneath, symbolizing death. Those taken to death dungeons were left to starve to death. After about 3 months of suffering, slaves were forced to go through the door of no return, where they were loaded on ships like cargo and shipped to America and Europe, never to return to their homeland again. After Ghana's independence in 1957, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, declared these castles and forts as World Heritage Sites. However, the atrocities committed against slaves in these dungeons are a dark stain on history, and their legacy is still felt to this day. Many descendants of slaves, including African Americans and diaspora Africans, make the journey to Ghana each year to visit the castles and pay their respects. In doing so, they honor the memory of those who suffered and perished in these terrible places. Today, many of the castles that once held slaves have been transformed into museums dedicated to educating visitors about the history of slavery and its lasting impact. Through exhibits, educational programs, and guided tours, these sites seek to provide a deeper understanding of this dark chapter in history and the ongoing effects it has on Africa and the rest of the world.